We're in the middle of our generosity series for the year. We believe that generosity is an extremely important value, and we want it to be something that characterizes our church. And so from the first day we started gathering as a church, we would pause in the middle of our service to make a declaration of generosity, a belief, a prayer about who we want to be, believing that what we say with our mouth begins to take root in our hearts, and it shapes the way we live our lives. We decided that weekly prayer was a really important thing, but we needed to take a little bit more time to unpack the nuances of this topic of generosity so that we could really live it out. And so we decided for the past couple of Novembers to take the entire month to talk about what it means to be generous. And this particular November, our goal is to talk about some of the enemies of generosity, some of the things that keep us from being generous. And as we say in our prayer, plunge our hearts to ruin. And so last week, we talked about greed. The week before that, we talked about envy. And tonight, we talk about gluttony. Envy being me wanting something that somebody else has and then resenting them for having it. Greed being holding on too tightly to the things that we have, whether big or small, lots of it or not enough of it. And then gluttony being the overconsumption or overuse of something. Overconsumption or overuse of something. Now, the funny thing about the last two, gluttony and sloth, so this week and next week, is they're not really words that we use very often, right? You might have used envy or greed in a sentence recently, but it's unlikely you've used the word gluttony or sloth in a sentence recently. And so I think synonyms kind of help frame our talk for tonight. And so we'll use a couple words here throughout the talk in order to define gluttony. One would be overconsumption, like I said a minute ago. Another would be intemperance, or lack of self-control, or no breaks. Essentially, an inability to stop consuming, or, and this is the interesting part, and the part that I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on tonight, the way that we consume things. It's not just the amount that we consume, or our inability to stop it, it's the attitude by which we consume things, the way that we go about it. I would like to propose tonight that gluttony is actually far more pervasive in our society and far more likely for you to encounter on a daily basis than we are willing to admit. We kind of relegate it to the most extreme situations, people who are addicted, people who have no self-control whatsoever. But I actually think that gluttony is something that we wrestle with pretty regularly. It's something we wrestle with in private, and it's something we wrestle with in public, and we rarely confront each other on it. It's a very socially acceptable sin or wrongdoing. It's something that we do all the time, and no one's really going to call us on the carpet on it. And so I'm going to do two things tonight. The first is I want to talk about how pervasive gluttony actually is, something that we're consistently confronted with. And the second is I want to talk about how gluttony does not affect just us. We tend to think that it's an isolated thing. If I were to overconsume, it really just affects me. But in reality, the overconsumption of anything affects the people around us as well. It's not just relegated to us. So in order to set the stage tonight, we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 17. We're going to be, not 17. Yes, 17, right. No, what chapter am I in, Kevin? 11, thank you, verses 17 through 22. I wrote it down wrong on my paper. There aren't 17 chapters, are there? Anyway, doesn't matter. All right, 11, 17 through 22. I basically just didn't put a chapter in here, but you know, we're on the same page now. This is a letter written from Paul to the first century church in Corinth. If you don't know anything about Paul, he wrote like half of the New Testament. He was like a Pharisee who learned under a rabbi for a really long time before he became a Christian. And before he converted to Christ, he was a persecutor of Christians. Even though he had a really significant conversion experience, he kept and held on to a lot of his sharpness and snark, and that comes out in all of his writing. And so a lot of his writings are really abrupt and even abrasive, but that's his personality. That's just kind of who he is. Not to mention that the church in Corinth had actually, from what we understand, wrote him first and said, hey, we know you're an opinionated guy. What do you think about some of the stuff we're doing? And he just unloaded on them in 2 full letters. And so you're going to get a little bit of that tonight, starting in chapter 11, verses 17 through 22, and then also a little bit of 33 and 34. It goes like this. In the following directives, I have no praise for you, for your meetings do more harm than good. In the first place, I hear that when you come together as a church, there are divisions among you, and to some extent, I believe it. No doubt there have to be differences among you in order to show which of you has God's approval. If you didn't catch the sarcasm in there, that was probably him being sarcastic. So then when you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper that you eat. For when you are eating, some of you go ahead with your own private suppers. As a result, one person remains hungry and the other gets drunk. Don't you have homes to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you? Certainly not in this matter. So then, my brothers and sisters, when you gather to eat, you should all eat together. Anyone who is hungry should eat something at home, so that when you meet together, it may not result in judgment. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. So apparently people were getting together, and they were not only having the Lord's Supper the way we do it, communion kind of with the crackers and the wine, but they were having a full meal together, which is actually the way we used to do communion when we first started at our community dinners. We had that kind of embedded in the rhythm of community dinners before we started doing it every single week. But there are people there who are probably upper-class citizens that are eating all the food and drinking all of the wine. And then the folks who are kind of last in line are getting less and maybe nothing at all, and they're going home hungry. Ironically, these are probably the people who actually showed up hungry, and then they stayed hungry, and then they left hungry. And Paul is saying, this cannot be. This cannot happen. This is not what it's supposed to be like. If you could imagine for a second that next week at our community dinner, I believe myself to be the pastor of, I'm the pastor of the church, but I believe myself to be important because I'm the pastor of the church. And so I get to the front of the line before anybody else, and I get all my food. In fact, I fill 2 plates because one plate's too small, and I heap up the food, and I bring it back here to a table, and I sit down, and I start to eat, and I completely disregard the fact that the line has come all the way through the hallway here like it always does, and there are people at the back that probably won't get to eat anything because I have 2 huge plates of food. And I eat a little bit, and then I throw the leftovers away because who cares? It's just food anyways. And there are people who don't get to eat in our church because I decided that I was more important than them, and I decided to fill my plates with a bunch of food that I didn't even need. Now, that's not my plan for next Sunday, but it's kind of my plan for Thursday. And it's kind of your plan too, like if we're honest, right? Like you're going to show up at somebody's house, maybe your own, and you're probably going to eat a tremendous amount of food. And nobody's going to call you on it because you're going to be like, yeah, like I ran a 5K today, and so yeah, it's okay for me to eat this whole tray of stuffing, right? Or it's my tradition to eat an entire pie. So, you can't judge me for that because it's my tradition. It's what I do every single Thanksgiving. We've turned a day of gratitude into a day of gluttony. It's a day where overconsumption is completely okay. And it doesn't just extend to Thanksgiving every year, right? Because if we're honest, it happens the next day too. Because on Friday, you don't have to work. And so on Friday, you're either going to mow somebody down at Walmart to get a TV, or you're going to maybe overconsume media, maybe you're going to overconsume sleep. But the reality is that Friday could be just as gluttonous as Thursday. And that could be true of the next day and the next day and the next day, because I really do think that we're faced with the temptation of this on a really regular basis. We participate in the overconsumption of food, media, drink, and other indulgences all the time. And we oftentimes find a way to justify it. Like we earned it, we deserve it, we're entitled to it. Gluttony isn't just something that addicts and people without self-control deal with. It's something that you will probably face tomorrow, if not tonight. And so I'm going to break it down here really quickly into a couple different types of gluttony. When I was doing my research, I was looking around for some nuances to gluttony because all I really knew was sort of this like over-the-top, somebody who just cannot stop themselves. And I wanted to find some nuances. And in my research, I came across this guy named Father Mike. He is a priest who makes YouTube videos, okay? So if you're thinking like old guy in a leather chair, you're wrong. This guy kind of looks like John Hamm in a collar, but he's making a lot of sense, and it's actually kind of a good video. It's very disorienting, but it's really great. And so anyway, he broke down gluttony into 4 different types, and I thought these were really helpful. So I've added my own ideas about attitudes that follow these different types of gluttony, and I'm going to go through these really quickly. The first is an issue of quantity. Eating, drinking, buying, sleeping, watching too much of something. And this is typically what we think of when we think of gluttony, just a quantity issue, just too much of any one thing. And it's certainly a form of gluttony and temptation that we face regularly, and it's not the only one. It's the one that we oftentimes think of, but it's not the only one. A couple of years ago, Julie took me to Fogo de Chao for my birthday. I don't know if you've ever been to this place. It's like a Brazilian steakhouse or something like that. You go in, you sit down, and they give you like this little card. And on one side it's red, and the other side it's green. And as you're sitting there, there are people milling about with like enormous pieces of meat on like a skewer and really sharp knives. And you sit there, and when you kind of catch, like there's somebody over there that has a piece of meat that I would like, then you just flip your little cart over to green, and then they'll see that, and they'll come over, and they'll start to shave meat off until you flip it over to red. You don't even need to talk to these people. Like you don't have to make eye contact. You don't have to talk to them. You have a card, and you're flipping, you're like, just, keep it coming until I flip it over to red. And then they walk away, and they go on to find the next, green card. And then when I want more food, I just keep doing that, back and forth with the red and the green. I ate so much meat that night. I woke up in a pool of my own sweat, and I had like 101 fever. I'm not kidding at all. I wasn't sick. I just ate way too much meat. I overdid it. I mean, and it's not just like in that one particular instance. That's an example. It's an extreme example. But there are often times where I overeat. I eat more than I need. I eat more than I need in order to feel full and satisfied. This is the typical way that we think of gluttony. It's an issue of quantity. The key attitude here is that my satisfaction is more important than anyone or anything else. My satisfaction is the most important thing. The second form of gluttony is an issue of quality. This is one that we get away with and ignore all the time. It's a refusal to consume something unless it is of a particular quality. So it's this kind of like highbrow snobbery that we practice with like food and coffee and things like that, and restaurants and clothes and cars and neighborhoods and that sort of thing. But we get away with it because we think of ourselves as people who just have good taste. Or we think of other people as like, well, they just have good taste. So yeah, it's totally okay for them to refuse to drink that coffee and pay that much for that coffee instead. I was faced with some conviction on this when we moved to Inglewood because I think of myself as one of these people who has really good taste, and I really like good food and good coffee and whatever. And we moved to Inglewood, and I was like, this is our town. Like, we're going to eat here, we're going to shop here, we're going to drink here. Everything we do is going to be right here in the city of Inglewood. And I still think that all the time, and we still talk about that all the time. But when I first moved here, I realized that Inglewood was massively devoid of like good food and good coffee and good, like I can get anything I want smothered in green chili in the city of Inglewood. Absolutely. And I can get a Coors Light anywhere I go. Like it exists and it's there. I can absolutely get that. But it's mostly diners and dives. And I had to kind of come to terms with my own sort of snobbery in this and realize that for me was a form of gluttony. It was an issue of quality for me. The key attitude to this kind of gluttony is that my pleasure is more important than anything else. That I feel pleased and that it's really my thing that trumps everybody else's desires or everybody else's commodity. The third form of gluttony that I'll talk about tonight is an issue of timing. This is an inability to wait for something. So this is a desire for instant gratification rather than delayed gratification. This is sometimes the thing we do when we hand over that plastic rectangle because we just can't wait to have that thing. We can't wait to save the money, and so we're going to rack up debt in order to get that. Whether sometimes it's a big thing, sometimes it's a small thing. But this is that desire, that deep need in order to get what I want right now. This issue of gluttony, this timing issue, is the thing that will fuel people on Friday as they rush to the shelves in the stores to get what they want. I have to have it right now. The key attitude to this kind of gluttony is that my gratification is more important than anything else. I need to be gratified. I deserved it. I earned it. I'm entitled to it. The fourth, last, and potentially the most common form of gluttony, I think, even though it's not the way we think about gluttony, it's probably the most commonly practiced form of gluttony, is an issue of purpose or rationale. This is when there's a lack of reason for doing something. This is usually an attempt to numb or escape or to anesthetize. This is like, I'm not sure why I'm watching this show, but I'm going to keep watching this show. And then at the end, if it's Netflix, the credits scroll, and the second the credits scroll, there's two boxes at the bottom. You know what I'm talking about. And one of them is like a whole nother show entirely, and the other one is the next episode for the same show, and there's a little ticker that's counting down from 5. You have 5 seconds to turn the TV off. It's like 5, 4, and you're like, oh, the remote's far, I can't. And you just sit there and you just, I will watch another one, right? Like I'm just the victim of my television. I'm just going to sit here and continue to consume this thing that I didn't even really choose. It just kind of chose me because I was really just scrolling through the various Netflix channels. Or when you're looking at Instagram and you're just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling through these, very unrealistic scenarios. Or you're on the stories section and it's just story after story after story. We're consuming to numb. We're consuming to anesthetize because probably either we have pain of some kind that we're trying to ignore, or the people around us have pain of some kind that we really don't want to address. It's easier to numb ourselves and medicate ourselves using media or food or a chemical or a relationship or whatever it is than it is to actually deal with the stuff that's going on in our lives. And that's why I think this might be the most common form of gluttony that we practice pretty regularly and we're faced with often. The key attitude here is that my avoidance is more important than anything or anyone else. I need to be able to separate myself because I can't deal with what's going on around me. Walter Brueggemann writes some interesting things. I could have just stopped there because he just writes a lot of interesting things, but he writes some interesting things about this topic specifically. He says this: "We who are now the richest nation are today's main coveters. We never feel that we have enough. We have to have more and more and more, and this insatiable desire destroys us. Whether we are liberal or conservative Christians, we must confess that the central problem of our lives is that we are torn apart by the conflict between our attraction to the good news of God's abundance and the power of our belief in scarcity. A belief that makes us greedy, mean, and unneighborly. We spend our lives trying to sort out that ambiguity." See, we think oftentimes that, envy, greed, gluttony, even sloth really come about for the people who have the most, who are affluent, who have a ton of stuff, a ton of money or a ton of possessions or whatever. But as Brueggemann says here, and I think he's right, oftentimes these things are born out of a sense of scarcity. A belief that what I have may not be around forever, so I better really use it. I better really consume it. Or I don't have enough, and so I'm going to be sort of obsessed with what other people have. This is our mentality so often, and scarcity is the thing that drives it. So gluttony takes many forms, and hopefully tonight you've been able to identify a few ways that it affects you. But it doesn't just affect you. And I think that's the thing that we can take away in terms of how this interacts with generosity. This may be an obvious statement to you, but the time that you spend over-consuming could be spent doing something productive or caring for someone in need. That might be an obvious statement to you, but I don't know that we're actually practicing that. The other thing to keep in mind is that the very thing that you're over-consuming could be used to care for someone else. Oftentimes, the thing we're over-consuming could be shared, frankly. It's just this really simple thing that I'm trying to teach my kids, like you should share with each other. And now I find myself wanting to teach our church that too. What if we shared? What would it look like to share with the people around us? This is a hard thing for all of us to understand. Our kids are starting to get it in some of the most difficult ways. Right now, this time of year, we always take them shopping with us to get the toys for the Bishop Christmas store. And it is a disorienting thing for a 4-year-old to buy some really cool gifts and to bring them over here and to leave them in that basket. They don't understand. They're like, why don't I get to play with that? And I'm like, because it's not yours. Like, you bought that for somebody else. And that is hard for them to understand because we are hardwired to hold on tightly to the things that are ours and oftentimes to overconsume. So real quick, right at the end here, what is the solution to gluttony? Like, what do we do differently? And I think that the most simple way to address that, the most simple answer to that question is that selflessness is the solution to gluttony. Selflessness is a consistent awareness of people's needs around you and a regular action to remedy those needs. So often ignorance about the needs of the people around us is the thing that drives us to be gluttonous or greedy or envious or whatever it is. That might sound elementary to you, like I said, but I really think that if we were to practice this, it would change things significantly. Selflessness does not mean that you stop taking care of yourself. It simply means, as Jesus said, you care for others like you care for yourself. It doesn't mean you don't care for yourself. It means you care for others like you care for yourself. That is the point. As this church becomes less selfish, we will increase in generosity, and as we'll say in just a minute, until it can be said there is no one in need among us. Can you imagine? Can you imagine the city of Inglewood with no needs? Let's get there someday, awesome. But can you imagine the people in this room having no needs? Because we were so open-handed with everything that we had. Instead of over-consuming, we were giving, we were selfless, we were generous with everything that we had. There were no needs in this room. No needs in this neighborhood, no needs in this parish. What if? Could you imagine that thing? It's an audacious thing, but I think it's completely possible. I genuinely believe that. We're going to say our generosity prayer, and then we're going to have communion together. If you would stand with me now and say a generosity prayer to close the sermon. All that we have received from God. We bring nothing into this world, and we take nothing out of it. We choose to follow the way of Jesus and increase in generosity until it can be said, there is no one in need among us. We choose to resist envy, greed, gluttony, and sloth, as these plunge our hearts to ruin. We choose to be faithful stewards of all our resources, relationships, time, possessions, and money. We choose to be generous because God is generous, and as his daughters and sons, we want to show the world what he is like. Amen.